answered or what you hope to learn through all of this. We are going to have some time at the end just to have a little Q&A. It won't be a lot of time, but we will be able to hit some of the questions that we got throughout this presentation.
All right, for everybody that just got on, we're gonna wait another 2 minutes before we get started, just to let the last couple of people jump on, and then we're gonna go ahead and get started. Again, like Sydney said, if you have any questions or anything that you already know that you wanna ask, feel free to type it out in the chat box, and we can go ahead and start answering some of those questions now.
Okay, guys, so we are going to go ahead and get started. We don't want to take up the rest of y'all's Thursday afternoon, so we're going to move through this kind of at a quick pace. If you do have questions, like I said earlier, we are going to have a short Q&A at the end, so feel free to send them as you come up with them, and then we'll answer what we can at the end, and then we'll actually send an email answering the rest of the questions probably tomorrow or Saturday morning. So on that note, we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Sydney. I'm the Center Director at the Brain Balance of Allen. I have been with Brain Balance for a little bit over 2 years now. I have done pretty much every role we have here, from working with all of the kids hands-on to doing the program director role and the center director role. And then of course, I'm gonna let Caroline introduce herself.
I am Caroline Enriquez. I am the program director here at the Brain Balance of Allen. I've been with Brain Balance for a little over a year. I started as a coach and then, like Sydney, moved up to the assistant director, and now I am the program director. And so we are excited to be here and excited to get to talk to y'all.
Awesome. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing the introduction of this presentation, and then Caroline's going to really dive into obviously what you guys are here for is how to work with your kids. Understanding what's going on is very, very important. And that's what we really want to use this presentation for is everybody who's online today should be able to walk away with saying, wow, I didn't know that about my kid before, and I've learned something new. We have several people who are on right now who have kids in the program right now. It's awesome to see you guys on here. And a lot of this information, it's not going to be new to you guys because you've heard us say it so many times. But once again, I still want you guys to be able to walk away and say, okay, I didn't know that. I have learned something new. I want to try this with my kiddo. Go ahead. So just a little bit of background on Brain Balance. This center here in Allen has been here for about 4 years now. We've worked with so many kiddos. We work with ages 4 all the way up till 24. So it's a very, very wide range. We have a really, really awesome team here. So this is just a picture of our team. If you come into the center, you're going to see all of us. We're always here. We recently reopened, so our hours are a little bit adjusted for everything going on, but we are here, we're answering calls, we're sending emails, we're having meetings, we're meeting with all of our kids, and we're meeting a lot of new kids. So that's just a little bit about us. And now we're going to dive into what everybody's here for, which is our presentation on understanding our child's brain function. So to begin to understand why your kid is doing what they do, why they're behaving the way they are, we really have to take things back to the beginning. And what I mean by this is we need to look at how the brain has developed over time. So we're going to start by looking at the natural path of development, what those steps look like, and kind of taking it back to infancy. When we're infants, we are 100% sensory beings. What I mean by this is when you have a baby, they are picking up anything in front of them and it is going in their mouth. Their foot, a block, a pencil, they don't care, it's going in their mouth. And they use this sensory seeking behavior to start to identify things, to start making connections in their brain and understanding the world around them. As our brain continues to develop, we actually start to move away from being 100% sensory seeking to start thinking about things cognitively and abstractly. So what I mean by this is when we have a baby, and if you're trying to talk to your baby like we should be socializing with them, they are not able to think about a block and say, okay, this is a block, it's square, it's plastic. But if I were to ask you, okay, close your eyes and imagine a block, you're able to think about something that's not in front of you without feeling it, without touching it or seeing it. So that's what I mean by abstractly. These are going to be things like higher executive functioning skills. We're going to talk about a lot of this today. Time management, organization, all of those pieces come as our brain starts to develop. So function always precedes development. And every family I meet with, some of them who are on here today have heard me say that probably 50 times in every meeting. Function always precedes development. So when we're looking at this developmental pyramid, we're going to see this several times throughout this presentation. Right now, I really just want us to focus on the overall process of development or the flow of this pyramid. So our goal for the developmental pyramid is just to show you how important having a strong foundation is. Synchronization is going to be where every family comes in and they're saying, oh my goodness, my kid struggles with focus. My kid struggles with organization. My kid can't sit still. They are off the wall, up and down, talking all the time, asking me a million questions. Well, we're not born with high levels of synchronization. But what we are born with is survival skills called primitive reflexes. And this is what's going to make up that first layer of development. So once we lay that solid foundation, now we're going to move up to our sensory motor skills. So things like being able to just hold your body upright throughout the day. And then we're going to move to our body awareness. So not only moving your body, but understanding how you're moving it. How fast did you push your brother? How fast did you run through the living room when I told you not to run that fast? And a lot of times, our kiddos that we work with, it's like, well, I've told them 12 times not to pet the dog that heavy, and yet they're still doing it. So body awareness is where that awareness of what you're doing comes into play. And then we have our eye function and synchronization. I mentioned this when we went on to this slide. This is going to be where those academic skills come into play, behavior skills. You need to have your eyes taking in all of that information to give an appropriate reaction. And we're going to go into information about that here in a moment. But like I said, our goal for this pyramid is understanding that we have to have a strong foundation. We have to have those primitive reflexes fully integrated. We have to have those solid, and then we also have to have a very, very strong core. So to get more involved with those reflexes, I mentioned that they're also sometimes called survival skills. An example of this that pretty much everybody has seen is going to be the palmar reflex. So you're playing with a baby, maybe it's your baby, maybe it's somebody else's, and everybody loves to stroke the baby's palm and have them grab onto their finger really tight. So this is actually going to be a palmar reflex, or the grasp reflex. What we see with this is you're having sensory input and you're having a reaction. So as we continue to elicit this motor response, it actually gets stronger, and that helps to develop our muscles in our hand. This is going to lead into things like the way you hold a pencil, the way your handwriting looks, the way you start to hold a baseball if you play sports, the way you catch a football. It also goes into the higher level things like cooking. Anything you're using your hands for, that palmar reflex is actually going to be laying the foundation for that. Some of these other reflexes that aren't listed in here, we're going to go into them a little bit later, but they all are incorporating things that go into eye tracking, like reading. They go into focus. They go into sitting still. This is just highlighting that that bottom of the pyramid, those primitive reflexes, is so, so important for building on those higher level skills. So we mentioned that we're sensory beings earlier, and I kind of gave you information that when you're an infant, sensory is everything. It's going in your mouth, you're touching everything, but that doesn't go away when we become adults. So we are considered sensory beings, but I kind of mentioned we turn into those abstract sensory beings. So we still need sensory input to provide a reaction. That does not go away. But what we start to do is have appropriate motor reactions. An example of this is if you're walking in a parking lot, and I'm at the center right now, so I'm like looking out the window, and there's people walking across the street. So they hear cars coming left and right. They can see a car coming. Maybe it's on the right side. They stop. They wait for the car to pass, or maybe they judge, you know what, that car's not super close to me. I can actually make it across the parking lot without getting run over. So this takes a lot of sensory input, but then their brain is actually processing all of this and giving them an appropriate response. So what happens when we have a student that's not processing all of those senses correctly? That's where we start to see those responses that are no longer appropriate. So that can be jumping up in a classroom, shouting something out. Maybe it's the student who you're supposed to be sitting down to eat, and they have to go get 12 million things, a paper towel, a different fork, I dropped my spoon, before they can sit down and just eat a meal. Our brain needs to be synchronized to allow for all of the appropriate sensory intake, as well as appropriate and time-effective motor output. So once again, this goes back to that foundation on the pyramid. We have to have the sensory input coming in appropriately to allow for appropriate output. So I've already said the word development probably 100 times since we started this, and we're only about 10 minutes in. But development is building connections from one part of the brain to another in the right timing. And that is key, the right timing. So, for example, we don't learn to roll over and then within 5 minutes stand up and start walking. At least we shouldn't be able to do that. Everything has a process. It has a flow, and this flow is very slow. As we saw in the developmental pyramid, a lot goes into developing. Our brain needs to develop connections very slowly in order for those connections to be strong and efficient. When we're about 2 years old is really when we have more connections in our brain than any other time in our life. And that sounds awesome. Wow, more connections, let's do it. But these connections, it actually becomes quantity over quality. So everybody has probably heard the term terrible twos. So as a 2-year-old, you're developing and making connections at such a fast rate, but those connections aren't efficient yet. So you're essentially working harder, not smarter. As natural development continues, we begin making more efficient connections. An example of this, and I did this the other day actually, is when we go to the grocery store and you don't have a list. So you start off in the frozen aisle and maybe you're getting ice cream, and then you're like, oh shoot, I have to get some dog food. And that's all the way on the other side of the store. And then it's like, oh man, I also wanted to get pizza because that's what the kids wanted for dinner. So now you're back to the frozen aisle. And then it's like, oh, I need to get some milk too. So now we're on the other side, and then we're going back to get vegetables. As you can imagine, you just spent 25 minutes at the grocery store and you have like 4 things. That is not efficient. So this is what a brain of a 2-year-old is doing. Things are all over the place. There's no organization, and they're not efficient. They're working very, very hard. As these connections start to become more efficient is when we see higher organization skills. It's when we see reasoning skills, processing skills. So it all comes down to making connections that are fast and efficient, not just having a bunch of connections all over the place. An example of one of the kids that I have here in programming right now, as soon as I was working on this PowerPoint, I just could not stop thinking about him. When he's in school, a few months ago when we had that school visit, his teacher was telling me, you know, he has independent work. So he gets some of his math homework, his English homework, all of these different things, and he'll have an hour or so to work on them. But he's getting so overwhelmed because his brain is saying, okay, do 1 question on math, read 1 sentence for English, now go to history, now go back here. That 20 minutes in, he's running around the classroom all over the place. And she was asking me, you know, what do we do? Well, first of all, let's give him some direction because his connections are all over the place. They're not efficient, and he's not able to prioritize. We're going to go into some more about that here in just a moment, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. You can go to the next slide. But that it happens with pretty much all of our kiddos that we see here. So what areas get impacted if our brain continues to work harder and not smarter? And I kind of answered that in the last slide with that example of that student. Attention and focus. If you are so all over the place in your mind of where do I need to go? What do I need to do next? We lack the focus to say, okay, let me do A, B, C. Instead, our processing becomes A, Q, M, P. It goes all over the place. Our social interactions start to get impacted. A lot of the kiddos we see struggle with auditory processing, anxiety, depression, and then we also have those physical symptoms, not just the things that are going inside of your body, but the fidgetiness, the inability to make friends. All of that's going to go into the lack of connections in your brain. So I mentioned earlier, I've mentioned several times now, that we begin as sensory beings, that we're 100% sensory. And it doesn't go away. We continue to need those senses working appropriately. So when you're taking notes in a classroom, or even if you have a kiddo who's watching TV, you need to do this in multi-sensory ways to help build up those connections. when we have a missing piece on the pyramid, the challenge is they don't ever truly go away. I can't tell you how many people I've met with who say, oh, you know what? My son was just like me whenever I was little. And now look at me. I'm doing great. Meanwhile, that parent is sitting in my office, reorganizing my desk, fidgeting constantly, and they're still exhibiting some of those signs. And that's not to say that nobody can mature out of some of these weaknesses, that nobody can quote unquote grow out of it. But what we really see is that it's less growing out of it and more learning how to cope with it. So on that note, those kiddos who have missing pieces on this pyramid, and we're going to dive into really what that looks like here in a few minutes, these issues don't go away. What we start to see is huge inconsistencies when we have these gaps. And that can be a student who they can do their homework at home 30 minutes and every single problem is right. And then they go to take a test and they bomb it. That can be the student who everybody knows they are so smart. They are probably the smartest kid in their class, but they cannot sit down long enough to fill out anything. So the teacher is telling you, yeah, you know, your student is they're incredible, they're so sweet, but I can't get them to focus. I can't get them to that other side. And that's where we see these imbalances of these huge strengths, but then these really weak weaknesses. And those are things that truly don't go away. So I've mentioned synchronization several times. It's the smallest part of that pyramid. So I mentioned it earlier. This is where all the academics, the behavior, all of that comes into play, but it's such a small area. And that has to have a strong foundation to fall back on, or we have those inconsistencies. So looking at this picture right now, we have a gentleman, he's sitting in a desk. There's a large group of people around him. He's typing on a computer. There's probably somebody lecturing at the front that we don't see. There's probably somebody clicking their pen. Somebody's probably popping their gum. There's a lot of different sensory noises, sights that are going on. So when you're sitting in this desk, how do you filter this out? As a student who struggles with focus, how do you redirect yourself and stay engaged with what you need to be prioritizing? All of those are going to be goal-oriented behaviors. But when we have an imbalance or an immaturity in any of the areas, the sensory, the core strength, the body awareness, the visual piece, or the synchronization, we start to see increases in the frustration. I'm trying so hard to stay focused. And then we hit that point of no longer being able to control that. And if we can't control our body, we can't control the decisions that we're making. So that's when we have a student who jumps up and yells, "Stop!" at the top of their lungs, and everybody kind of turns and looks, and it's like, what's going on? Those are those kiddos who they are working 10 times harder than anybody else in the room to meet the bare minimum, and even sometimes they're falling short of that. These are also the students who maybe they can hold it together at school, but they get off the bus, or maybe they leave soccer practice and they get home and it's a nightmare. It's a totally different kid. These are the kiddos who are truly, truly struggling, and this is coming from those imbalances through that developmental pyramid. So when should you worry? I know one of the slides before said that some kids do mature out of this. They learn different techniques. They learn different ways to cope with these things. But when, as a parent, should you worry about what your kiddo's doing? And the answer to that is when you find yourself needing to intervene consistently. So if your student is unable to get homework done, if they are just running around nonstop, especially during a focus-based activity, such as eating, writing, even if it's like a game night, so like a board game, if they're just bouncing up and down, if they don't understand what you're saying, if you ask them to go pick up their shoes from the living room and it takes them 12 times and you keep asking them to go do that, if you find yourself repeating over and over and over again, an answer to a question that's very simple. When you find yourself needing to redirect on that regular basis, and you find that your kiddo is unable to self-regulate independently, you're having to come in and essentially act as that synchronization piece for them because they are so inconsistent that they can't rely on it themselves. When you really start to notice that it's impacting your kiddo's daily experiences and really holding them back, because when we do have a student who's working so hard to meet that bare minimum, I kind of mentioned it, they're exhausted. So how do you go in and enjoy, recess? How do you go and enjoy the rest of your time when you know that you're going to have to go back and sit down at school, or when you know you're going to have to work so hard on your online learning at home? It gets very hard for those kiddos. And that's when, as a parent, you should really start to worry, is when you find yourself stepping in and having to kind of pull everything back together for them. So at this point, we have gone through the natural flow of development. And I really just wanted to give everybody a sound understanding of that path before we dive into kind of managing those symptoms. And I know that's really why everybody's here, is to get the ideas, is to get the tips on, okay, I know what's going on, but now what can I do? What can I go home and try right now? And so for that, I am going to turn it over to Caroline. She's program director here, so this is really where her expertise lies, at the center, working with the parents, always coming up with new ideas and new ways to get our kiddos to succeed.
Yes, so all of these tips and tricks that I'm going to give you guys are things that I have been giving our parents currently as we are all learning how to manage and go through this unprecedented time. So they've all been tested, they're all being used by our parents, and I've heard a lot of really good success coming back from our parents, so hopefully it's able to do the same for y'all. So ways to help manage the day. First off, the home environment is the key to creating success. When we think about the day and we think about our child's day, we want to make sure that they're getting movement and sensory input. So what this looks like is, are they exercising? Are they able to move? I always recommend our parents, the first thing your kid does when they get up, they can brush their teeth, but then maybe you have them do some exercises. Maybe you have them go through a small stretching routine, something to get them moving and get that sensory input going. The goal is to stimulate all of the senses throughout the day. This really helps start to connect some of those parts of the brain and different things like that. Movement and senses, like your senses, smell, taste, everything else like that, helps feed development. So when we look at every 2 hours, they need to have a brain break. This was especially important when I was working with our families who are now doing e-learning, like I'm sure most of you were experiencing or transitioning into summer. Brain breaks are one of my favorite things, and typically, I think 2 hours is a long time. So I know personally I have to do brain breaks more often. It's totally going to depend on your kid and what works best for you guys. So a brain break would look like, okay, I know you can work for 30 minutes, and then you need to stand up and stretch your legs and do a little bit of exercise, and then we can go back to working. So that's perfect. You do have them sit down and do their homework for 30 minutes. You stand up for 5 to 10 minutes and you do exercises. Some of these exercises can be jumping jacks, hopping on one leg, crawling, doing some simple yoga, anything that gets them moving. I've had a lot of parents come back and tell me, I've turned it into a game. I made it a scavenger hunt. So basically I have the kids, I say, okay, go find something that's the color red. I count to 3, they have 15 seconds to go find the color red and bring it back to me. Anything like that gets them up and gets them moving and not focused on whatever activity they were doing before is what I consider a brain break. So for these brain breaks, we do school visits here, and I went to a school and a teacher was like, I have a student and they're really struggling with transitioning from one activity to another. And I said, do a brain break. As simple as that sounds, have him when you get done with math, he loved math and he was so mad that he had to go to the next subject. I said about 5 minutes before math ends, have him run an errand for you. When he comes back, you'll already be in reading or whatever the other subject was. That transition's over. If your child struggles with transition, brain breaks are perfect. Another tip I give for these brain breaks is incorporating a timer. A timer is a very good visual cue that helps your child see exactly how much longer they have to transition into a different activity. So, like I said, for example, if 15 minutes is all your child can sit and focus on, that's totally fine. So, you'll set the timer for 15 minutes and then you'll give them a verbal cue. Okay, you have 10 minutes left, buddy, and then we're going to do your brain break. When the timer goes off, they know to get up, do the brain break, and then when they come back, they know they'll be in a different activity. These are just a couple tips to help make that brain break a little smoother and help allow for smoother transitions. Some kids need sensory input to work. So, speaking specifically about academics first, we know that alternative seating is a perfect example of this sensory input. A lot of kids are sitting on yoga balls, sitting crisscross, anything that engages those muscles and engages their core that helps that sensory input. Another good thing that you can do is having them do tummy time. When we think of tummy time, we think of babies, we think of infants, but this is actually really good for older children too. It helps with their muscles, it helps that sensory input, which when you give them sensory input allows for them to focus longer. It allows for them to work longer. Another good way to do sensory input can include deep pressure. This might be a weighted blanket. It might be them leaning up against a desk, something like that. Another thing is those fidget tools. Those are a good tool for sensory input. Anything that allows the child to continue working and get that sensory input while they're working. Movement and exercise engages your brain. That is definitely something that we focus on here, obviously. We do a lot of exercises to help our kiddos begin to create those sensory inputs and different things like that. Providing a space for your child. This is specific for each child. You need to have a space that your child can go to when they know that they are overwhelmed, that they can just calm down. I went to another school visit for a little kid that just got overwhelmed very easily and he would just flip out, and the teacher was like, I have a space, but he doesn't like going there. I said, well, where does he like to go? And she said, he likes to go under the desk. And I said, then let him go there, let him calm down, and when he's ready, have him come out. Having a space for your child to go where they can feel secure and they can calm down is super important. Also having a space where they can play and develop independently. So giving them a craft or some schoolwork to work on or some sort of play equipment like Legos, dolls, balls, anything like that that allows them to play independently. That includes no siblings, no instructions from you being like, okay, well, build the Lego piece like this, nothing. Allowing them to work on that creativity, work on that fine motor and their time management, everything by themselves is super important. Going along with providing space for them is creating consistency. I told all of my parents when this started that creating a schedule is extremely important for a child's success. So, having a visual representation of their schedule allows a child to know exactly what to expect and exactly they're going to do next. So I said to all of our parents, use a visual schedule that corresponds with what your child is interested in. So if you know your son loves superheroes, incorporate superhero pictures onto the visual schedule. That way he knows, oh, it's noon, my superhero's eating lunch. I'm going to eat lunch. I want to be like my superhero. That keeps them intrigued and keeps them interested. Also, having your child help you create the schedule also really will engage them as well. So obviously some things you can't change the time on, like soccer practice at 5 o'clock, you can't change that. But you can change things like, okay, when you wake up, do you want to get out of bed and brush your teeth, or do you want to get out of bed and make your bed? Giving them that control, while that's a simple choice, it makes them feel like they are in control. It gives them that feeling that, oh, yes, I know what's expected. I know what I need to do, but I picked it. I'm in control. So those are definitely just a couple of tips that we can do to incorporate and manage the day to give them that sensory input that they're looking for.
I do want to say really quickly, we did get a few questions in. We're going to answer those when we get to the end because we do want to be able to cover everything. So keep sending those questions in. We're going to answer them when we get to the end.
Perfect. So this next slide, it is a picture of some of our coaches and some of our kiddos. This is just some of what we do in our center. So when our kids come for the in-center program, we incorporate all their senses because we know how critical it is to get that sensory input throughout the day. So we do a lot of exercises and we really focus on that core. We have an entire section that just focuses on those core muscles and building them. We do planks, lateral planks, Supermans, you name it. We are engaging the core through those exercises. We work on proprioception and incorporate different fine motor activities, all while providing that sensory input and making those connections. As we are feeding that sensory input, we are seeing an increase in emotional regulation, self-control, increase in social skills, and so many other factors that are on the developmental pyramid that we begin to see change because we are feeding that sensory input. Not only are we feeding the sensory input through exercises and movement, but like I said, we use smell, we use oil, essential oils, and sound. The increases in sensory input allows for more pathways and connections to be made in the brain so we can continue to have the child be successful in all situations of their life. A couple examples of the kiddos that are in our program that we have seen do leaps and bounds. Some of them have graduated, some of them haven't. I had a family come back from earlier and they said, you know, we're super excited. Our kid is now able to ride a bike. And I was like, that's awesome. I mean, and to be able to ride a bike, while it seems like such a small thing, it is a huge thing for that child. I mean, that just raises their self-confidence. It really boosts their, oh, look at this, I can do this. And you can just see them glowing. It was so fun to talk to them about it and get to hear their side of it. But that was something that they weren't able to do because they were lacking all of these connections. I had another family come in, and the kid was so excited to come tell me that they had finally gotten an A on their first test. And this was a kid that I would have never thought struggled with grades before because they held it all together, but they just couldn't. They got so stressed out before the test and they just couldn't perform, like Sydney was mentioning earlier. And they came in and they told me, they were like, I'm so excited I got an A, and it was their first A. And just things like that, those small changes, they make the world of the difference. And that is really one of the things that happens here. So secret number 2, we want to get to the root cause of their challenges. So like I said, we go back to the beginning. We want to ensure that there's a whole brain connectivity. So I talk to all of my parents during progress reports and I tell them that this pyramid is a puzzle. So we're going to see some portions of it that are at 100%, and that is so great. But if everything else isn't right there with it, we're still going to be seeing some of those gaps. We're still going to be seeing some of the challenges that we were seeing before. So our initial assessment shows us exactly where those gaps are. It shows us, okay, yes, they are thriving in this area, but we're really seeing a decline here. It allows us to make that program that we can say, here we go, we're going to fill in these gaps and we're good to go. So obviously looking at this pyramid, we look at the primitive reflexes. And I know primitive reflexes can be kind of confusing, but a few examples on how these primitive reflexes can affect a child. So if we look at the Moro reflex, if the Moro reflex is present, it can lead to a high fight or flight and low emotional regulation. So if you think you're sitting in class and someone drops a book, yeah, you might be startled a little, but you're okay. You're able to bring it back down and be like, oh, they just dropped a book. A child that has the Moro reflex is not able to just say, oh, okay, they just dropped a book. It sends their body into that fight or flight mode. So they are already at their threshold. They can't come back down like you or I would be able to. How do you expect them to continue learning if they're already at that threshold? It would be very challenging. So that's just one example of the moral reflex. Another primitive reflex is the ATNR reflex. So when you think about if my head looks left, I can move my head left without moving my whole body. The ATNR reflex would make me move my head left, and my hips and my shoulders would also move left. While you're thinking, I mean, that doesn't seem horrible. If you think about, again, a child in class, if something happens and they move their head to the right, their whole body moves to the right. If they move their head back to the center, their whole body moves to the center. And like Sydney was mentioning, that just becomes exhausting throughout the day. And while it's so simple, it is something that becomes so exhausting that they have those emotional outbursts because they're so tired. They're so irritable. And then you're thinking, well, what's wrong with my kid? It's the ATNR. Next, we'll talk about the spinal galant. So if the spinal galant is still prevalent, it can lead to an increased fidgety behavior. So we see a lot of kids that if they have spinal galant, they're extremely fidgety and they struggle with focus because they're constantly having to move, constantly having to fidget with something, and it doesn't allow them to focus at school, at soccer practice, whatever it may be. A lot of the reflexes are intertwined. So you'll see that they obviously all work together and they all share a part in the development. So secret number 3 is improving the focus and behavior at home without medications. So at Brain Balance, we are a non-medical facility. So we try to keep the kids off medication as much as we can. And we do it through the whole child approach. I always recommend that our parents, while they're in programming or before they start programming, they read Dr. Malello's Disconnected Kid book. Dr. Malello is the founder of Brain Balance, and it goes into more detail about primitive reflexes and about the developmental pyramid more than we can do tonight, or we would be here all night talking about primitive reflexes in the pyramid.
Yes. So I actually want to go back just a few slides. When we're talking about primitive reflexes, I mentioned at the very beginning, these are survival skills. These are essential survival skills when we are an infant. As we continue to move and as we continue to develop, these need to no longer be present because we should have those higher level skills that are taking over. And so that's where we mentioned, with that palmar reflex, as you start to develop that muscle control, your hand shouldn't just kind of grab around somebody's finger anymore. Your brain should be able to shut that off, and you should be able to control it individually and have better control of your individual muscles. And that also goes into your eyes and other brain functions as well. So I just wanted to kind of hit on that before we move forward. So primitive reflexes, survival skills early on, but they no longer need to be apparent as we continue developing. And that's really where we start to see these gaps, is when these are left on, they're not allowing your body to progress through that natural pathway through the pyramid. So what we see on the outside is really what's considered a symptom. So the very top of this iceberg, this is where we see the behavior, we see the social skill struggles, we see anxiety, we see attention struggles, academics, whether your student is struggling or maybe failing. All of those are going to be at the very top. But what we don't see is all of the underlying, and that's truly where the issue is. Caroline mentioned earlier that student who came back and they're like, oh my gosh, I rode a bike. Whenever I hear a kid say that, and maybe I don't remember how old this student was, I think he was about 12. When I hear that, it just makes me go back and say, wow, his core strength must have been low before he started here. Some of his underlying sensory processing, those reflexes were very high. They were very apparent, because what his parents, what the school, and even what we here at the center don't see is what is truly holding these kiddos back. And that's where we see the gross motor, the fine motor, the overall processing, the ability to learn. We don't see all of those things. All we see is that tipping point. We see that kid pick up the remote and chunk it across the room because they are just done. We see that kid who just gives up on school when they become a teenager because it's, in their words, too hard for them. They can't focus. They can't do it. When we go back and look at those underlying, that bottom of the iceberg, that's where we see you can do it. You're just having to work 10 times harder. When we start to fill in these gaps, when we stimulate the sensory, when we give them that sensory input, that's where we start to see more connections made. And we start to see those small wins, like Caroline mentioned, riding a bike, getting an A. I have some kids who walk into the center and they get A's all the time, all day, every day. They are straight A kids, but they cannot hold a conversation. And I mentioned it earlier, as we work with kids who have incredible talents. There is not a student that I have ever met in the center, outside of the center, who doesn't excel in some area of life. Our goal, not just at Brain Balance, our goal in the community is getting all of our kiddos to succeed. Everybody should be able to see the potential, see where they can go, and allow them to be the best them possible. We've talked about those root challenges, the cognitive tasks, the focus, the memory, recalling information, all of the executive functioning, the emotions, the organization. And then we also went over some of those tips, feeding that sensory input. That is where you're going to see success. And I know it sounds very simple. Oh, I can turn on music. But when these kiddos are missing all of that sensory, or they're really struggling to get the right amount, it makes a world of difference. And every kid is very unique. So we don't have a single kid that we work with that I can say, okay, ABC works for this kid. I'm going to do exact same thing for kid number 2, even if they're related, and have it work. Every kid is so unique. And it takes a little bit of trial and error to find out, does your kid need, that deep pressure? Do they need a weighted blanket? Or does your kid need to be playing with sand, that light input? Does that need to be their brain break? It's very different for everybody. I wish we could say, here's an exact plan, try this immediately without meeting your student, but that's not how the world works. Overall, just a little bit more about our program. I mentioned earlier, we have some families who are already in the program, and we're so thankful that you guys are here. I hope y'all have learned something. If you don't know anything about Brain Balance, if you have just briefly heard us on the radio or you stumbled across our Facebook page, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about us here. I really want to answer any questions that you guys have at this point. I know we've gotten several in, so Caroline, we can actually start with that first one.
Perfect. So what are some of the symptoms which highlight that my child has sensory struggles?
Sorry, I'm rereading that. What are some of the symptoms which highlight that my child has sensory struggles? So once again, I mentioned this is going to be very different for every child. A kiddo who struggles with sensory, maybe they're covering their ears when you're in the car and you're talking and the radio's going and it's like, well, nothing's really loud, but yet you have a kid covering their ears. Maybe they're complaining that the TV is too loud. That's going to be more in the auditory processing. But it also can be visual. I have a student that I work with right now, and this is kind of leading us into the next question, but he struggles with transitions. Transitions are very, very difficult for him. If we go from, maybe we're doing some fine motor activities and it's time for him to work on core, what I actually have done, because he gets so visually overstimulated, is I turn the lights off. And that's his transition. And it's very simple. We turn it off, and that's his way of knowing, okay, this is very consistent. The lights turn off. I need to stop what I'm doing because it's time to move on. So going into the next question, a brain break as a distraction for transition. How do you phase out a distracted transition and adjust to transitions overall? This is probably a question I would say we hear all the time. And to get a kid to really work with transitions takes time. transitions, even as an adult, can be hard. And we have seen that with everything going on with Corona. That transition from what we knew as the norm, what we were doing on a day-to-day basis, was very hard for people. I know that I struggled with it, with my routine being upset. So when we take that from a student's point of view, let's say we have a 6-year-old, and they are struggling with some of these developmental gaps. When we sit there and we just walk in and say, okay, math is over, we're not doing E1 for math anymore, go get a puzzle, we're doing this now. That is essentially like we took their world and we just flipped it over. Our goal needs to be a slow transition. So a lot of our families really benefit from a warning. Okay, in just a few moments, we're going to switch over to this. We're going to switch over to this in 1 minute. We're going to switch over to this in 45 seconds. Acting as those higher processing skills until that student has that ability on their own is very crucial. And I know that sounds like a lot on your part as a parent, but the goal is to get them to be able to transition smoothly on their own. And until they're there, getting these tricks almost of, okay, let's go run an errand like Caroline did with that one student, because then they're not having to go put their stuff up. They're not having to physically transition, which is what is hard for them. They're getting distracted and they're coming back and the transition's already happened. It's not chaos in a classroom, or it's not chaos at home because they're having to clean things up or move things around. That piece is already taken out of the equation for them. And then you would want to introduce it slowly. So maybe, and I'm just going to use an example Caroline had, maybe that student goes and puts his computer away and then goes runs an errand. So there's a little bit more that he's responsible for, and then you would add things in one at a time to help make sure that's very smooth. Anything to add with that?
Nope, that was perfect. It's definitely, like Sydney said, a very slow process, and giving those verbal cues, that's kind of why I brought up the timer. The timer is a great visual cue, especially if your child is older. They can look at the timer and they can understand, okay, 2 minutes, that's it. And giving that verbal cue, like Sydney said, you have 60 seconds, you have 1 minute, and then we're going to do whatever it is. So giving them that cue and then giving them the expectation of what's coming next really helps set them up for success in that transition. Obviously, like Sydney said, it's a slow process. So eventually you want to get to just the timer or just a verbal cue, but it is something that comes over time.
I'm not a big fan of screen time, but there is an app. I wish I had the name of it. I don't have it on my phone anymore, but it's a countdown timer. Mm-hmm. So the student actually picks a picture, and it's all pictures of animals. So there's like a panda, a giraffe. They pick a picture, and then you set the timer, whether it's 15 seconds, 30 seconds. And once it goes off, that picture of the animal is revealed. So all of a sudden, transitions aren't painful. They're not having to put something away that they enjoy doing. They're getting to do a fun activity, and then, okay, it's a lot smoother. Now we're on to the next thing, but when I finish this, I get to pick that picture again and see it revealed. That works really well with younger kids. Older kids, it's going to be more of those brain breaks, those sensory inputs. Okay, let's work out 10 push-ups before we move on to the next subject. Getting them to be engaged, but you're still acting as that higher executive processing piece until they're capable on their own. And that's really a parent judgment call of, okay, I'm seeing my kid get more responsible. They're taking more responsibility. They're doing better on organization. They're doing better on time management. Give them more to do. Challenge them. You don't want to make it extremely difficult, but you do want to keep pushing them. You don't want to act as that synchronization piece for the rest of their life. You want them to take that on and continue growing. But what we see with the kiddos that we work with who have a lot of these missing pieces is that they are overwhelmed. So when we can act as that higher piece and we can take some of that load off until they're truly ready, they have a lot easier time developing and being ready. So the next few slides that we have just go into more about our program. Like I said, we've talked about all these pieces. We want to build brain connectivity, and whether that is just taking the ideas that Caroline has shared, taking the information I shared in the beginning, and putting that to use at home, stimulating the sensory input, using music, using visuals, using smell, building muscles, all of that is going to help build up that brain connectivity. This page is just talking about our research. Brain Balance is a new program, truly. We have a lot of ongoing research. We have our Harvard study going on right now. So a lot more to come on exactly what we do here. Lots of interesting information. If you have any questions about that, you can definitely reach out. We can send you all of that research information. We are about at the end. We have just a few more questions or a few more minutes if anybody has questions. But I did just want to say for everybody who's new, we are offering 10 in-center assessments at a reduced price. So it's the $99. If you're interested, definitely reach out to us to take advantage of that. If you aren't ready to do an assessment, if you just have more questions, if you just want to kind of get on the phone and talk to Caroline or talk to myself, that's free. We are always here to walk parents through anything that they need. At this point, if anybody else has any other questions, oh, we do have one. Can I do anything early to get ahead of these struggles? So this is kind of taking it back to the beginning. I'm trying to make this really quick because I don't want to take up everybody's night. But in an infant, stimulating the sensory, we've said it 12 million times now, feeding that sensory piece is key. Even if it's a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, start stimulating that, increase tummy time. Even if they're already walking, make them crawl around. Even if you have a 10-year-old, get them to crawl through your house in a maze, in an obstacle course. All of these things that are fun and engaging for a kid, that it's like, oh, I don't want my living room to get messy, or I don't want the kids to pull this apart. Let them engage in all of those pieces, especially with how often we're having to be at home right now. It is such an easy way to get ahead of things like inability to focus in a classroom, especially when we're looking at going into the summer and the kids are going to be home. Take advantage of this time to start increasing their core strength, start increasing even fine motor skills, just playing with toys, writing, drawing, coloring. All of those pieces are going to help feed into that sensory input. And it's so awesome to incorporate all of them at the same time. Play some music. Put the diffuser on with peppermint or eucalyptus or lavender. Get all of those senses working at the same time and build that connectivity while doing those activities.
Perfect. I just want to piggyback off what Sydney said for 1 second. She mentioned even if you're not interested and you don't think brain balance is the way for you, but you do have questions. Like she said, we are always here. I can't tell you how many times I followed up with people that are like, I don't think brain balance is the right path for me, but I need help. I'll follow up with them later because we want to help the community. We can help guide you in another direction or anything like that. So if y'all have any questions, we're definitely here for you, even if you don't think brain balance is the right direction for you. We just want to help our community and help the kids who need it.
And then also, I've said it several times, we have several parents who have either done the program previously or who are in programming right now. And so if y'all have any other questions on kind of the flow of development or things going on, we're always here to answer questions. You don't have to wait for a progress report or anything like that.
Awesome. If anybody else has any questions, you can ask them now. If not, I think that's about all we have.
So once again, guys, thank you so much for joining. Caroline and I are going to hang out for about 2 or 3 more minutes in case anybody wants to jump on and ask anything. Other than that, I hope everybody enjoys their weekend. We're moving into Friday, so hopefully the weather stays nice. Thanks, guys. Oh, hey, Vanessa. We actually have it recorded, so I can send that to your email address. Erin, yes, we are actually going to upload it to our YouTube channel, and we're going to send it out. So you'll definitely be able to rewatch it at any time if you need to.
Vanessa, we are so glad to hear that. Like I said, we just want to help you guys in any way we can. And if you want any more tips or tricks, I have so many of them. I have been adding to my library during this whole social distancing, just trying to help our families. So feel free to shoot us over an email or give us a call. We are